Joining us now also, Lucien Smith, attorney, former chairman of the Mississippi GOP. Lucien, thanks so much for coming in today.
Hey, it's great to be here, Gerard.
We have got a lot of stuff, as you know, going on the national scale and also here in the state of Mississippi. But one of the things that cropped up last week that I think prompted me to ask you to come in today was we've got these mandates from the federal government, from Joe Biden. He has essentially, I believe, via executive order instructed OSHA to promulgate some policy that would require private sector organizations, private businesses, to vaccinate their employees if they have more than 100 employees, I think right. is the threshold. But then we're seeing some calls within our state for the governor to perhaps convene a special session to enact legislation that would essentially ban the federal mandate. And doing a little research overnight, looks like Texas, Alabama, Florida, Arizona are considering similar measures. So the question comes up, Lucien, what happens when you've got federal, I don't know if I call it law, but regulation maybe.
Right.
And then you've got state law, and they conflict. How's that resolved?
You know, it depends on whether the federal law or regulation is validly issued.
Okay.
And let me say this: I'm 100% opposed to governmental mandates of vaccines for COVID. I think you can have a conversation about, you know, if the Black Plague came back, if the Spanish flu came back, where the harm was so great that there might be a reason to do it. I'm absolutely opposed to what the president did and what he's asked OSHA to do. But the question from a legal perspective is it a validly issued federal law or federal regulation? Because under the Constitution, there's the supremacy clause that states that that federal law is supreme to state law.
Right.
But the question is, was it validly issued? And so if, in fact, OSHA has the authority to do this rule on an emergency basis, there's not a great deal that the state can do about it. Now, I do think in this case there's some legal opportunities to fight back against this rule. And the best one that comes to mind to me is how fast the administration is going. Generally, when you are issuing new federal regulations, and keep in mind, you know, even though the president says, you know, I'm issuing an executive order, what matters isn't his executive order. What matters is what does OSHA actually come up with is how the rule is in force. And generally speaking, when OSHA comes up with new rules, they go through an extensive rulemaking process where they put the proposed rule out for what's called a notice and comment period, where the people who are affected are able to come back and say, here's some problems we think that there are with the rule, here's how you should adjust it. And that whole process can take a year or more to get there. Well, here the president wants this rule in effect now, and there are ways for OSHA to short-circuit that rule-making process. But the only way that they can do that is if they can demonstrate that there is a grave danger to the safety of workers. Okay. And I think that's, at first blush, the best legal option, because I'm not convinced there's a grave threat to American workers. Yeah. The vaccine is available now such that if you're not vaccinated in this country, it's either because you don't want to, or because you've got some sort of health or religious reason or some other reason where you've chosen not to. We are no longer in the position we were in February where people wanted to be vaccinated but couldn't be. If you want to be vaccinated right now in America, you've been vaccinated.
Yeah.
And to my mind, the data is pretty clear that vaccination decreases your likelihood of having a serious episode of COVID, you're less likely to be hospitalized, you're less likely to be killed. People can make their own decision about whether or not they want to do it. But it's less clear that being vaccinated decreases transmission. I'm no scientist, but I've certainly seen credible reporting of studies on both sides of that. And so to my mind, you know, it's not clear there's a grave danger that allows OSHA to impose this regulation that quickly. And I think that's where we're more likely to see some effect is by going to federal court and challenging these sorts of rules.
Well, OSHA hasn't They haven't released the rules yet.
They've sent them to the Office of Management and Budget for review, but to my knowledge, they've not made those rules public. I haven't seen them, and I don't think they're publicly available.
I think that's right. And so I thought we would see challenges right off the bat, but I guess until the rules are out and released, anyone who would mount a legal challenge wants to see that first.
I think you need to see the final rule because it's possible. I don't think it's likely with the Joe Biden OSHA, but I mean it's possible that you'll have people over there write a rule that. I think Biden's motivated more by politics here than public health. I think the vaccines have become so much an article of faith among people on the left that he wants to show that, by golly, he's making everybody get a vaccine. And it's possible that when we actually look at the rule from OSHA that it'll have enough exceptions in it that it won't be as bad as a lot of us expect it to be. But yeah, until we really see the rule, it's very difficult to challenge. You run into some standing problems, and you also just run into a substantive problem because you don't really know what you're challenging.
Yeah. And so just have to be sorted out in the courts. And I'm not sure how the courts would rule on something like this. And you'd have to believe, would you start in federal court and work your way up to Supreme Court?
You'd go into a federal district court. You'd ask for some sort of either a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction to prevent it from going into effect once you saw the rule. And then you'd have a hearing on a permanent injunction, and then it would go up through the appellate courts, first to the courts of appeal, and then if the U.S. Supreme Court chose to take it, to the Supreme Court. But I'm very confident that once that rule comes out, unless it's a total political farce that has so many exceptions to it that it doesn't really apply, I think you'll see litigation, and I think it'll be solved. But I think the highest likelihood of it getting blocked is going to be over the speed at which it's gone through, and the fact that it's probably not going to comply with the notice and comment requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act.
Yeah, and that makes total sense there. So, all right, so we got the situation in Mississippi here just yesterday, I believe, Lucien, where the IHL board, the college board, voted 9-3 to require shots for educators and staff who work at Mississippi's public universities. Now, originally, there was no such requirement, but I think, the best I can tell, this is in response to the Biden administration's order that all those who have federal contracts with the federal government have to be vaccinated. I mean, this is the way they're trying to push it
airlines. That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're looking for some nexus because, and this is something that Representative Owen, Jansen Owen, called for this special session to deal with these, and it's one of the points I think he points out very accurately the amount of pressure that's getting put on individuals to make these decisions. But the federal, traditionally, and this is in his letter, the state has broad police power. That's the legal term that people use, the police power, and it's not just the police. It's the power to deal with the health and safety and welfare of your population. So as a general rule, if we could go back in a time machine and talk to the people who wrote the Constitution, my guess is James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, they'd say, if you had them on the show, they'd say, yeah, Gerard, a state could absolutely require vaccinations. That is well within the traditional police power of the state. And if you ask them, do you think the federal government could mandate vaccines? They think that was crazy.
Yeah.
And that's because these are traditionally state-focused powers, but what they're looking for are these ways of using federal power to coerce this. And I think the federal contractor route is what they've done, and it's what you've seen over the course of the last 100 years. There's so much federal money out there. So many states and entities have become dependent on federal money to one degree or another. That the federal government doesn't really have to have a straight-up mandate because that would be invalidly passed. They can say, okay, well, you don't have to do this, but we're going to take away the $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion that we're giving you.
Always the carrot.
That's right. I mean, that's what happened. If you look historically, that's what happened when the drinking ages across the country went from 18 to 21. Mm-hmm. You had a handful of states. Louisiana was the last holdout where you could buy an adult beverage at 18, and the federal government tried to mandate it, and they said, well, you can't mandate that it goes up to 21. They said, that's fine, we'll just stop paying for your highways.
Yeah.
And, Louisiana almost immediately capitulated because the money was too great, and they had to take it.
Tried to do it with Medicaid expansion.
That's exactly
right. That was a key part of the ruling that essentially allowed Obamacare to continue as being constitutional, but there was that aspect of it.
That's right.
That is the reason we did not expand Medicaid in Mississippi.
It was really the only Obamacare litigation that was successful in that early era was that Mississippi was a party of that case. I was one of Governor Barber's lawyers when we filed that lawsuit.
I remember it well. We got a break right here. You can stick around, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to talk some more. We got Lucien Smith here in the studio. Stay with us. Middays. We'll be right back. Lucien Smith, attorney and former chairman of the Mississippi GOP. Also have the honor of and pleasure of working with Lucien the last couple of years as our counsel for the Mississippi Lottery Corporation.
That's right.
It's been a lot of fun. I saw someone won $100,000, I think.
I saw that headline.
Yeah.
I hadn't read it yet, but I saw that. That's great.
On the Mississippi Drawdown game, I believe. So,
that's right.
Yeah. So it's been a lot of fun doing that, Lucien. We got a good group, and I hope folks are pleased with the program we've built here in the state.
Well, I hadn't been associated with something like this like you have. It's fascinating to watch. I mean, it was a startup.
Yeah.
There was a time where there wasn't a single employee.
Right.
And you've watched it grow to. I forget how many total employees it has now, but I mean it is a big going concern, and you watched it from nothing, which has been really cool to be a part of and watch.
I know you weren't present when I went down for my examination by the Senate.
I was not there for that.
It was rather fun.
I still feel bad. I asked one of my partners to go because I had a conflict and had said these things are normally pro forma. You'll probably be there 30 minutes at tops, and only because there'll be a bunch of other people that are going to ask questions.
30 minutes for all five members.
For all five, and whoever else is getting confirmed that day. And about an hour and a half in, I looked on Twitter and saw that he was testifying at one point. And I thought, gosh, I probably should have asked him more than 20 minutes before it started, but I'm very appreciative of him going.
I was at the podium there for about 45 minutes as a couple of senators dug into the weeds in question. But nonetheless, that's water under the bridge. All right, so here's a question. Why couldn't the Trump admin stop federal money for sanctuary cities, but they could stop federal funds from universities? And let's be clear here, this isn't federal funds. These are contracts between the federal government and the university, just as you've heard, as we talked about off the air, airlines that have contracts with the federal government and a number of other private sector institutions as well. So, I mean, I feel like that I could support the idea of the federal government listing that, if you will, as a requirement. Like they have many other requirements to do business with the federal government. I don't have an issue with that. I have an issue with them mandating that any private sector business, whether they have a contract or not, I think you and I are in agreement that that's overstepping their bounds.
I think that's right. I mean, I think they have the authority to say as a condition, like you said, as a condition of getting this money, you must do X, Y, and Z. I don't think they should have the authority to mandate that private businesses do it. But this is the reason it's so important that people show up and vote every 2 years in the federal elections, because there's a lot of stuff the federal government can do. There's also a lot of that stuff that they can do that they should not do.
Correct.
And at the end of the day, the question comes down to, is Joe Biden or Donald Trump in the White House? Is a conservative or a liberal there? And that's why we've got to show up and make sure we elect people who are going to make the right decisions. And I think we got to challenge the bad decisions when we think we got a good faith legal basis to challenge them in the courts. I don't know the answer to specifically to the sanctuary cities question. That is a very valid, good question. I think there's been this increase, especially under the Trump administration, in these national injunctions getting issued by federal judges. And the Supreme Court has hinted that they might take a look at it. It used to be generally when you got an injunction, it was inside of the jurisdiction of that specific judge. So if you thought the federal government was doing something wrong, you didn't have a judge in Jackson, Mississippi telling the entire country that was enjoined. They would enjoin it in their district. And increasingly, you're seeing judges out in the district courts issue these injunctions that are binding nationwide. And I think that is something that we need to take a look at from a statutory perspective. But I think you're going to see the Supreme Court take a look at that eventually, because I just don't think it's the right way to run a railroad. You get these very political local judges issuing national injunctions that really ought to be dealt with through the policymaking process, not in the courts.
And you and I were also discussing offline the idea that government would also step in and prohibit a private organization for instituting their internal vaccine mandate, for example. I find that overstepping government's purview as well.
I 100% agree with you. I think a person with a private business should be able to decide what they do with their private business. I think the one potential exception to that is in the racial discrimination context, where there's very clear federal constitutional law with regards to the Civil Rights Act. But if you want to say whatever your requirement is as a business, I think is reasonable. If you want to have a dress code, if you want to say nobody can come in here without having had a COVID vaccine, if you're a real conservative, you believe in property rights.
Right.
And if somebody says, look, you can't buy coffee from me unless you have a COVID vaccine or have these beliefs or wear pants, whatever you want to do, I think as a conservative, that's your right. Now, my right as a citizen, as a consumer, is to say, well, I'm not going to Gerard's coffee shop because he requires a vaccine. I'm going to go over across the way to that guy's who doesn't. And I think you've already seen that with the masks that continue to be required by some businesses even after you had the state mask mandate. I found myself, especially after I got vaccinated, if there was one store, if there was a gas station that still required it, and for a while there were, and a gas station that didn't, I just made a point of going to the gas station that didn't require the mask mandate because I didn't think it was necessary.
Sure.
But that's my right as a consumer to have that choice. And that's also the business's prerogative to say, look, this is a private business. I'm not compelling you to come here. And so I think I agree with you, Jordan. I think these laws, I think people need to think about the Masterpiece Cake Shop Supreme Court case.
Yep, same deal.
Bakery in Colorado. They were asked by a same-sex couple to bake a cake, and they said, look, we are Christians. This violates our deeply held beliefs, and we don't want to participate. Colorado, the state, had a law that required them to participate, went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, for First Amendment reasons, said you don't have to do that. Well, I think just as in a free society, a private business that's not receiving some sort of federal funds that came with special requirements, they should be able to say, I don't want to bake you a cake. And in a free and open society, you can go across the street and find somebody else who'd be happy to do it. And I think the same thing is true here. If you thought the baker and Masterpiece Cake Shop ought not have been compelled to bake the cake, you should also think that the guy who owns Masterpiece Cake Shop can say, look, I need to see a vaccine card before I'll sell you a cake.
Absolutely agree.
You can vote with your feet and go to somewhere else. That to me is is what being a conservative, being a liberty-minded conservative really means.
Excellent summary and analysis. And I'll say this as well. I think to a great extent, the concept of socialism has been sort of hijacked, and it's kind of been extended to represent lots of different things. Government programs, for example, such as family leave, which is part of the Biden Build Back Better agenda. A lot of folks would look at that and say, well, that's socialism. To me, true socialism, central planning, determining by a central authority how goods and services should be made and the amount that should be made, and how what that operation should look like, that is essentially going to a private sector business and saying, you cannot mandate vaccinations.
Yeah.
You're telling me how to run my business, and it's beyond reasonable, I think, from a regulatory perspective.
I think that's right. And what you've seen time and time again, and virtually every time we've had some sort of experiment with this, the private sector, without government intervention, does a much better job of allocating resources, of coming up with great ideas, of figuring out the future than government does. And so we're just better off, I think, any opportunity we have to make government smaller, to decrease programs, to decrease the regulations, and let the private sector do what it does. That's how we're going to bring more and better jobs. That's how we're going to increase prosperity. That's how we build back better, is by getting government out of the way. Not by having increasing amounts of government intervention.
Just seems like we've departed from that very simple foundational principle and concept, which has created the greatness that is this country.
That's exactly right. We don't want to get rid of billionaires. We want more billionaires. We want as many as we can get. We want more people getting rich because that means they're out creating great products. They're selling them to people. The consumers are better off because they're receiving good products. The person who invested, the person who took that risk, the people who took those risks, they're better off. That is how we grow. Again, that's how how we build back better, is that, not raising taxes and giving the government more involved in things.
I couldn't agree more. Thomas in Greenwood says, and if you as a company don't comply, what is the punishment? No government money or contracts, anything else like a fine? Yeah, there actually is a fine, Thomas. I think it's $14,000 per incident.
Per instant. The fine is going to be absolutely crushing for small businesses. You know, that whenever the Democrats talk about some of these initiatives, they talk about it in the context of massive corporations who have huge compliance teams. But if you're a typical small, medium business that's got 5, 10, 20 employees, you probably don't have somebody sitting there every day working on compliance, and that's going to be a real burden, both on the fine side and on the compliance side. So,
you want to hang around? Do the break? Yeah.
Sure thing.
We got Lucien Smith in the 15th.
Y'all get to texting.
There you go. Appreciate that, Rhino. All right, so Lucien, one of the things that comes up, and I think we probably share in the frustration from our audience, that we've got these mandates that the federal government is handing down to private sector or private businesses, but with respect for those streaming across our border and those that are on some form of, which is a lot, on some sort of federal subsistence, there are no such mandates. It does seem a little targeted, if you will, at the private sector. It does seem like it is a double standard. I'll just call it that again. I mean, your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it is a double standard, and I think it comes from the fact that the people who are in charge right now view the private sector with contempt. They think that if you have been successful at however you want to define successful, whether you're somebody who's running a $400,000 a year business that employs a couple people, or you're Jeff Bezos, they think if you're doing that, you've done something wrong. It hadn't been fair. I mean, you remember Barack Obama's comment back when he was president. He said, you didn't build that, talking about how these sorts of businesses wouldn't have existed without significant federal and other governmental help. And so I do think there's a lot of contempt there. And it also shows you how I think how frequently the policymaking with regards to COVID at the top level, I'm not talking about the Thomas Dobbs, the people who are, in the weeds, but from the federal level, how much of it is just driven by virtue signaling. We're
totally agree.
Vaccines are kind of it's one of the elements of the civil religion, and so we're gonna mandate it because that's right. But we're not really going to stop people coming across the border who aren't tested. We're going to go ahead and move them in. We're going to put them up in hotels. We're going to go back to catch and release. We're going to let these people, without any sort of testing, controls, vaccines, just come on into the country. Well, to your point, it is a double standard, and it's also a totally incoherent policy. I mean, if this is, and I think it's been one of the problems with COVID all along, we didn't know what it was 2 years ago. When it came up in February, we didn't know, were we living in one of these horror movies where everybody's about to die and, it's going to be some horrible thing? And so you can understand these extreme measures on the front end. But now we've gotten to the point where we recognize, every death is terrible. Every death is a tragedy, but this disproportionately affects people above the age of 55. It disproportionately affects people with pre-existing conditions. Nearly half the deaths have come from people over the age of 75, and every one of those is a tragedy. Every one of those is something that should be taken seriously. But the focus has been on this sort of virtue signaling. On the one hand, we're going to require vaccines, we're going to require masks, but we're also going to virtue signal on this open border, defund the police, abolish ICE, let everybody come in stuff. That's no way to run a government. We need to have serious discussions about policy and work through the areas we disagree with and come to it with a seriousness of purpose that I think is lacking right now.
It seems like there's so precious little where there is any alignment on policy.
Right.
And all you got to do is look at the president's domestic agenda to know that, because virtually everything in that domestic agenda on the spending and the taxing side is objectionable to the right, to the Republicans. Not a single one has signaled that they would support that measure.
Yeah, and I don't blame them, because it's so, the Democratic Party has become so captive to their far left that a lot of these policies, there's no real change. They're having trouble getting the Democrats all lined up for it before you try to get to the Republicans. But I think what people are desperate for, I think it's one of the reasons that Donald Trump did have such a following when he got into office and when he got into the campaign. People are desperate for leadership. I don't think people mind somebody in elected office who disagrees with them, but I think what they want is somebody who comes out and says, this is what I'm going to do. Here's why I'm going to do it. This is why I think it's a good thing. and somebody who's not afraid to do. It's one thing for Biden to lecture the Democrats, or for a Republican to lecture, for Biden to lecture the Republicans, or for a Republican to lecture the Democrats, but to have Biden turn to his left flank and say, look, we're not going to do all that, because America's a center-right country. We're not going to have $5 trillion every year in new spending, because we'll go bankrupt and destroy the fabric of the country. But you just don't see that. And I think we need more people in office, Gerard, who are not afraid to lose, because the way the country is right now, certainly if you're looking at Congress, the biggest risk to most congressmen, to most U.S. senators, is getting beat in a primary. There are a handful of swing states. Georgia's a good example where you've got to worry about the middle. But in all likelihood, Mississippi is never going to elect. I say never. Mississippi is not going to elect a Democratic senator anytime soon. The only risk in a state like Mississippi is in a primary. And I think a lot of Roger Wicker and Cindy Hyde-Smith, but we need across the country and other states that are similar, and that they're only going to elect Republicans. We need people who say, you know what, I'm willing to explain why something's a bad idea. We need Democrats who are willing to go to their base too and say, I'm not for that, and some of them are going to get beat. But if we had some real leaders, I think we could get so much more accomplished instead of just playing to the base constantly.
I couldn't agree more. And I feel like, Lucien, that to a great extent, our party is not effectively messaging. And I don't know if it's because of who kind of by default is delivering the message, or if it's the content of the message itself. I don't feel like we're doing enough. To a great extent, we're talking to those who agree with us.
That's right.
And we're not really getting through to maybe those in the middle, the critical independents that could go either way.
I think that's right.
To get them to see and align with our positions on these policy. Unfortunately, this Build Back Better agenda, which started out at $3.5 trillion, I've done the taken out the accounting gimmickry and said it's really $7 trillion at the end of the day. It's wildly popular. I mean, the idea of raising taxes on the wealthy in society, the idea of paying everybody $300 a month for child tax credit, is really just welfare at the end of the day. Just here's some money because you have a child. It is kind of couched by the administration as a child tax credit, but you get it whether you owe any taxes or not. So that's why I just take that out of the equation. So you got that, and family leave, and free community college, and free pre-K, and all these other programs, expansion of Obamacare subsidies. Those are actually wildly popular. My concern is that we probably are going to get a scaled-down version of this bill, is what it looks like right now. And Biden's poll numbers are going to start to rise as a result.
That's very popular. I mean, that's very possible, and they are popular ideas. I think when you start explaining to people the true cost of them, that's where I think you start to change the popularity, because the ideas are great, and the way the Democrats sell it is they make it sound like there are just a handful of billionaires out there who, if you remember the old Scrooge McDuck cartoon, who are just swimming around in their swimming pool of gold doubloons, and we're just going to go take a few of those gold doubloons that they don't really need, and we're going to give them over to people so they can have free community college, paid family leave, et cetera, et cetera. But in truth, and you've seen this in these analyses, Biden said nobody who makes makes less than $400,000 is going to see their taxes go up. Every time you've had a critical analysis of it, you've figured out that people's taxes have to go up, and the reason is you could take 100% of the income from these billionaires every year, 100%, not let them have a penny of income. It still wouldn't pay for all these programs. So people who are trying to figure out how they're going to get by on what they're making now are going to see their taxes go up. It's just a fiction that these programs aren't going to cost people more in taxes. Now, if they want to go vote for that's their right in a free society. But I think the question is, do you want to have people who take that money and go out, invest it in businesses, create more jobs dealing with that money? Or do you want to let a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington spend that money? And I guarantee you that second path is less prosperity, less freedom, and a more bleak future for America. And we need to fight it every way we can.
Arguably the worst fiduciaries on the planet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Boy, I mean, I just don't get it, why that would be considered a more efficient use of capital. And it's just not. It's the least efficient use of
Absolutely.
Well, I feel like, and I talked about this earlier in the show before we go here, that to some extent they're tone deaf. that the so-called kitchen table issues don't include climate change and transgender rights? I don't think that's coming up at the kitchen table.
People want to know if they're going to keep their job, if they're going to get a better job, if they're going to be able to put groceries on the table and maybe have a little left over to enjoy, and are their children going to get a good education and be able to have the same opportunities they did. I mean, those are kitchen table issues, and they're issues on which Republicans win, and I think you're right. If we are talking about policy, if the Republican Party is talking about policy in an election, we are going to win. If we are talking about personality and narrative, we're going to lose.
That's
so we got to
exactly
stick
right.
with good policy.
Totally agree. Thanks so much for coming in, Lucien.
Absolutely.
Really enjoyed it. We'll be back with final segment and the winner of the tickets when we come back.